Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 41 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard.
And myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisis.ie.
I should have told them I was a barrister as well, Mark, so people, nobody would have guessed, even at this late stage. Mark, great to see you, and we got a great reaction to part one of our interview with Rory Carroll, and we're going to run part two today, and that is for the legal train spotters out there. I think we're heavily on law this time, or the legal aspects of the interview.
I think I managed to squeeze in a couple of legal questions.
You wanted to go straight to the trial.
Absolutely.
So I think we deal with a lot of good stuff here. Your expert evidence, etc., featured, didn't it?
Absolutely. Forensics, fingerprints.
The forensics are very good.
Handwriting.
And in particular, Richard Ferguson, QC, who represented Patrick Magee, who came from a completely different background to him, and yet Magee was very happy with the representation, and I thought Rory Carroll was very good on that. So that's coming up. But first, we're going to discuss three cases that you have identified on the Decisis website. In the first case this week, the issue of adjudication in construction contracts arises. The adjudicator herein had made a ruling in relation to a payment dispute, but one of the parties sought to challenge it by way of judicial review. This is the case of K&J Townmore Construction Limited versus Keogh, and it's a High Court decision of Mr. Justice Toomey.
That's right. So the peculiar thing about this, well, it basically dates back to the Construction Contracts Act of 2013, and that changed the way that disputes with subcontractors were dealt with in construction cases. Because the problem very often was that if there was an issue in relation to work or payment, that the whole project would kind of cease. So the purpose of bringing in adjudication under the Act was that the adjudicator would effectively make an interim award that would say, right, in order to keep this project ongoing, a certain payment should be made, and then the matter can go to arbitration at a later stage in order to determine the ultimate rights and wrongs. So it's like an injunction, except that it's to do with payment of money. But what happened here was that one of the parties was not happy with the work of the adjudicator, and because it arises under statute, they thought, we'll be able to judicially review this. But of course, because it's only an interim award, effectively, the High Court said, look, that is not the purpose of judicial review, because you have another course of action here. The appropriate forum for resolving this particular dispute is simply to challenge the adjudicator's dispute as part of the arbitration proceedings. So they basically said, you shouldn't have brought judicial review. You should have gone by way of arbitration.
Okay, fair enough. And I suppose clear guidelines going forward as a result of that. So finally, we look at a sentencing judgment where the court had to consider the offence of disposing of a firearm that had been used in a murder. The trial judge thought that the offender was already serving a prison sentence and therefore applied the principle of totality. You're going to have to explain that one, Mark. In reducing the sentence, the Court of Appeal found the sentence, however, was too lenient. And this is the case of the Director of Public Prosecutions versus Merryman. And the leading decision was given by the President of the Court, George Birmingham.
That's right. So, as you said, this concerns the disposal of a firearm that had been used in a murder. And what the sentencing judge said was that the appropriate sentence was 6.5 years imprisonment. However, the sentencing judge was under the impression that the offender was currently serving another sentence and made this sentence consecutive to that. So basically, this sentence would have started on the completion of the previous sentence. So on the basis of the principle of totality, which basically means how long that the offender is going to remain in prison altogether, he then reduced this sentence to 4.5 years. However, it then transpired, I don't know how this error arose, but it transpired that the offender was not currently serving a sentence of imprisonment. And so the appeal court looked at this and said, well, clearly this is an extremely serious offence, disposing of a murder weapon. And said that in the circumstances that the original sentence of 6.5 years was the appropriate one. So that's what they restored.
Extended to 6.5 years from 4.5. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I should just say that is 6.5 years imprisonment with the last 18 months suspended, as in fact the original one had been 4.5 years with 18 months suspended.
Okay, thank you for clarifying there, Mark. Okay, back now at part 2 of our interview with Rory Carroll.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So if we can just look a little bit about the trial. I mean, first of all, his counsel, I suppose, is an interesting character, isn't that right? Richard Ferguson.
Yes, it was astonishing conjunction that Patrick Magee's defense lawyer was this QC, Richard Ferguson, who was a Protestant origin from Fermanagh. His dad had been a sergeant in the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and he'd been a Unionist MP in the Northern Ireland Parliament in the late 1960s. And yet here he is, in the 1986, in the trial, representing the Brighton bomber, not just an IRA man, but the guy who almost killed Thatcher. And because Richard Ferguson, he had been he'd been very liberal unionist. I know some people think that's an oxymoron, but I mean, he had been. But he left.
He'd effectively been run out of Northern Ireland. I mean, he was part of the sort of Terence O'Neill sort of, let's be a little bit nicer school of unionism, and effectively told where to go by the people who didn't sympathise with Terence O'Neill.
That's right. His house was burnt down, apparently by a loyalist mob. And so he ended up, he practiced law also in Dublin, I think, as well as Belfast, but then he moved to England in the early 80s and became very successful. He became one of the best paid defence barristers in England. I think he's earning £800,000 a year in the 80s. And he went on to defend a whole spectrum of people, including Rose West. But Patrick,
did the maths.
And so this was the guy who was representing the Brighton bomber. And Patrick Magee is quite complimentary about Richard Ferguson. He credits him as a lawyer with doing an excellent job of defending him. Really did his best to get Magee off. And Magee did it.
What were the points of defence, Rory? Like, what did Ferguson focus on? The evidence against Magee was pretty damning. There wasn't a lot to work with. Did he kind of go into philosophical defences and
it was
political crimes, all that sort of stuff?
No, it was a very technical forensic defense and a genuine attempt, which could have worked to get Magee off by trying to pick holes in the evidence and just put enough doubt in the minds of the jury. And the thesis of the defense was that the police framed Patrick Magee. It was that, okay, the bomb has gone off. The police go through their files of known IRA bombers, and Magee is in the list. And his face kind of fits. I think, yeah, he'd be a good guy to get him. Now, at this point, the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 were still in prison. They had not been exonerated yet, but there was already a lot of doubt and awareness of the fact that British police have and would do something like this. They can frame and do frame people. And so Richard Ferguson's thesis was that the British police decided early on in the investigation, okay, Magee will fit. He can be our guy, our fall guy for this. And so that they then transposed his fingerprints onto the hotel registration card for his guilt. And secondly, that they found, because it wasn't even clear where the bomb had been planted. We knew that, the guy who checked in as Roy Walsh had been in room 629, but was that really necessarily the case? Because if the bomb had been in another room, maybe it wasn't even him, so he's able to kind of cast a doubt, or try to cast a doubt on where the bomb had actually exploded. And also he tried to suggest that the British police, they're all very clubby. All these experts, the exhibits officers, the forensics officers, the fingerprint guys, that they're all crucial links in the evidentiary chain, but also they kind of know each other. They kind of hang out, might go to the pub, and that they therefore could cook up a plot to frame Patrick Magee.
But the only actual evidence linking Patrick Magee himself to the Brighton Hotel was the fingerprint. Is that right?
Well, that was the single most crucial, damning piece of evidence.
And when you interviewed Patrick Magee, am I right, he said that he still reckons that his fingerprint had not been on that card.
Yeah, it gets a bit kind of funny here. Patrick Magee admits that he did sign the hotel registration card, and basically so that he is the guy who planted the bomb. But he maintains to this day that he did not touch the hotel registration card. Now, I've tried doing it myself. You should try. Just get pen and you try to, can it possibly do it? And because for him it was a test of field terrorism or field craft. Can you do this without leaving a fingerprint? And I think, he's either maybe embarrassed or offended that, he screwed up, because the idea is that he screwed up. So he says his implication is that he didn't do it. He did not leave his print on it, and therefore the implication is the British police must have planted it.
But there is the alternative explanation. We know that the IRA was very heavily infiltrated. They may have known perfectly well it was him and planted the fingerprint and used that in order to hide their sources. Isn't that the alternative explanation?
Well, the IRA were very infiltrated overall, but in 1985, 84, not yet, not as fully as they later became. And also, the British authorities really had no idea, they had no intel at all on it. They just knew that they had a very thick, bulging file on Magee. There already lots of fingerprints from him from when he was a teenager, breaking into shops in Norwich. Yeah, I mean, you think since he admits that he signed the card, and yet he says as if like the police then got a lucky guess that they're going to frame him, and then they happen to frame the right guy. So
Not unheard of.
But despite Ferguson's best efforts, Magee was convicted. Did the jury take a long time to reach a conclusion? Maybe that's an unfair question, Rory, but
5 hours.
5 hours, okay. So there was something to be debated anyway. He certainly created some small element of doubt.
Certainly, Magee felt that he did a good job. Roy Ferguson defending him, and he said
it sounds almost like an OJ defense. This kind of conspiracy of police.
Yes,
if the glove doesn't fit, this sort of stuff.
And Ferguson did confront on the stand, policeman after policeman saying, "I put it to you that you planted this or that you did that," and each of them, of course, rebuffed him. They said, but he after the trial, Magee asked his lawyer Ferguson, "Do you think I got a fair trial?" And according to Magee, Ferguson said no. He thought he did not get a fair trial, but he didn't elaborate. Now, I tried when I was doing the research for this. Richard Ferguson unfortunately died some time ago, but I reached out to his widow, Rosa, to say, did he leave his files? Did he have a diary? Is anything I could get? And she broke my heart. She said, well, he did. He left a whole stack of stuff. He had so many files on all of his cases. Yeah, and I shredded them all.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I said, because for different reasons, they've been around for so long. Yeah, so then maybe that's another reason why there's not that much of the trial in the book.
Sorry, no, Mark, please.
Just wanted to ask you about the other piece of forensic evidence, the handwriting evidence. So the slip when he was signing into the hotel had an unusual letter E, and that was found to correspond with the letter E in a crossword that was done in the Glasgow flat they were caught in. Isn't that right? Except
it wasn't London. It was a flat in London, so that a safe house. So yes, Magee, because he used the signing in on the registration card. Roy Walsh was the pseudonym, but he said your nationality English, and in the E in English had this distinctive kind of extra line through it. And so the police kind of seized on this. They put it on Crime Watch. Has anybody seen somebody writing an E in this way? It became a thing. And then in the investigation, they discovered that the IRA had a safe house in East London where there's a pistol and kind of IRA equipment. And there's also a crossword puzzle. And Magee was quite a cerebral guy. He read a lot, did crosswords. I don't know if it's the cryptic one or not. But
which newspaper was it?
You know what? I've asked the cops this. I asked Magee that. I so wanted to know, is it the Daily Telegraph? Is it Daily Mail? I cannot get a straight answer from anybody, so I had
Not the Irish Times.
Alas, not the Irish Times. So in the crossword puzzle, there was an E. And again, I've also asked the police and Magee, what was the word? What was, the word? And again, that fragment of detail is lost to history. But that E in the crossword had the same signatory kind of extra line through it. So this was another part in the evidentiary chain connecting Magee, in this case, to this IRA safe house in London that was being used for this new plot, post-Brighton, and that also linked him to Brighton itself.
Okay, so he was convicted, as you say. Jury deliberated for 5 hours, and he was convicted. And he got a huge sentence. Unsurprisingly, it was a huge sentence.
35 years.
35 years. So, really, at that age, what would he have been? He would have been mid-30s, would he?
He was 35, and 35. As soon as the judge said, I sentenced you to 35 years, Magee thought, well, I am 35. He thought, okay, so I'm going to get out when I'm... And the judge said, minimum 35 years. So Magee thought, okay, I'm going to get out when I'm 70. And he said, and his dad had lived, or his grandfather, until he was 77. So he just thought, or 74. So he thought, maybe I'll have 4, 5, 6 years of freedom at the end. And
I suppose we should say he was a married man. He had one child. Mm-hmm. So, he was looking at a long stretch. Now, the way he used his time, I think the phrase often used associated with, let's say, IRA prisoners, etc., nor meekly serve my time. He engaged extensively in sort of academic research, didn't he? did a PhD while he was incarcerated. And then, obviously, political developments came to a head, Good Friday Agreement, and then he was going to be, like all other Republican prisoners, he was going to be released as part of that agreement. Wasn't that the case? But there was a bit of a twist with the Labour government. They were resistant to him being released.
Yes, because fast forward, he's been in prison for about 15 years. Then Good Friday Agreement is signed in 1998. And part of the agreement is that all paramilitary prisoners will be released. And so they started the process. And then after about a year, they're kind of working their way through, the list of releases. And then they're getting to Magee. And for the Tony Blair government, that was kind of problematic because it was these releases are among the most controversial aspects of the whole Good Friday Agreement. And then to release the Brighton bomber, the guy who almost killed Thatcher. So Jack Straw, who was then the Home Secretary, took a high court action to try to stop it. But, Magee himself, and I agree with him, thinks that it was a bit of... the judge rejected it, and Magee was released on schedule. And it was kind of a face-saving exercise that the British government knew he was going to get out anyway, but they had to go through the motions of trying to stop it.
Okay, so a little bit of showboating. There wasn't any grounds on which they could really distinguish him from another Republican prisoner. Sure there wasn't?
No, well, they did try. What they cited was that he had been convicted in an English jail, and on that reason, he should not be allowed out. And in fact, that argument really offended unionists in Northern Ireland because, they were, why should you distinguish between,
So Brexit before Brexit. So he emerges out and he's had a fascinating career, if that's the right word. Probably not the right word, but life, let's say, after being released. Let's talk about that. Another sort of aspect of this case that we're interested in is restorative justice. And Patrick Magee has developed, he has toured the world and developed a particular relationship with the daughter of one of the victims of the bombing in Brighton. There was 5 people killed. One was a man called Sir Anthony Berry, who was a Tory MP. He was killed in the bombing. And his daughter and Patrick Magee met and have formed a sort of a relationship, not a romantic relationship, but a relationship where they've talked about the issues of restorative justice and, a victim and perpetrator coming together, etc. Rory, will you talk to us about that?
Sure. Well, just a little bit of context. When you've come out of prison after that, it's very difficult. You almost have to reinvent yourself. And, the cliche is such a stereotype with that, when the loyalist prisoners come out of prison, they all come out kind of all bulked up because they've been kind of working out in prison. And when the Republican ones come out, they've all got kind of owlish glasses because they've all become, they've been reading books. And Magee kind of fit that stereotype because he became out as a doctor. He got a PhD. And he could have, gone into academia because, he's written 2 books. And they're good. He's bright. But no academic institution would touch him because of his notoriety, which is understandable. And so what could he do? He had no job, and he had to earn something. So he ends up working on building sites in Dublin, in the Celtic Tiger. Now it's like 2000s. And by then he was already in his 50s. And so it was difficult, but then out of the blue, Jo Berry, and she was the daughter of Sir Anthony Berry, who was a Conservative MP and had been a whip in the Tory party, who was one of the 5 people who died in the Grand Hotel. She reached out to Magee after he was released and requested a meeting. And her motivation was that she wanted to try and find some meaning in her father's murder. Why? Because she'd been a teenager when he had died, and so she had, I wouldn't say had a kind of a spiritual journey. She would go to India and into karma and try to find some meaning. So Magee very warily agreed to meet her. Had this remarkable encounter where he explained his own history of why he joined the IRA and I guess about the bombing and how he perceived the conflict and why he did what he did. And this led to a really remarkable friendship, which has now endured more than 20 years. And they've formed this, I don't want to trivialize it as a double act, but they appear together on stage at events around the world discussing restorative justice, memory, healing, forgiveness. And what makes it interesting is it's not an easy kind of thing between them because it's not like he's found God. He hasn't. What he's found is that he's acknowledged that, firstly, the humanity of the people he killed, something that he, in the time when he did it, he kind of blocked that out. And also the cost to his own humanity of his actions. Yet he still defends what he did. He defends the Brighton bombing. He defends the IRA campaign as legitimate acts of war. And so this makes Joe Berry's view on this, so it's they're a relationship. It's not about some pat reconciliation.
I mean, this is a very sort of live issue in the courts generally, sort of whether you can bring the victim or the victim's family together with the offender. And I suppose what I find myself wondering is how, at this stage, does Joe Berry react to that? The idea that he sort of says, okay, well, I understand that I killed 5 people, I effectively destroyed 5 families, and obviously there's still people like Norman Tebbett's wife who was paralysed. I'm sure there's a lot more understanding that he has, but at the end of the day, he effectively says, I would do the same again. And how does Joe Berry react to that?
Well, she wrote the foreword to his memoir, and so I think, the subtitle of his memoir is Where Grieving Begins, and I think it's about building bridges, and that's the core of their relationship in a way, is how you can build a relationship of trust, a mutual understanding, even when there remains that gulf. And so she's managed to do it. And it's been kind of controversial in that some people laud her and think that's been a brave, enlightened thing to do. Others think it's very misguided and that you're giving a free pass to someone who still says that not that he would do it again as such, but yes, if the same circumstances were replicated, that he would still do it again or defend it again. So I know Norman Tebbett and some of the police I spoke to were appalled by what she's doing. But then, there was another guy called Harvey Thomas. He was a Conservative Party member who survived. He was in the hotel. And, he was blown up and had a horrific ordeal, but he survived. And at the time, his wife was heavily pregnant. She was due to go into labor. She wasn't in the hotel, but, it could have destroyed that family. And yet he forgave Magee, largely on religious grounds. And Magee struck up a beautiful friendship with Harvey Thomas, whom he almost killed, and his family. And the daughter, who almost, and he used to visit them in England. So it just shows, people respond and react to atrocities and can react in so many different ways.
He is truly a fascinating character. And I just want to say to everybody, we're probably coming towards the end mark, are we? We don't even put a clock on this. But if anybody has a question, I think Rory's open to questions from the floor. So please indicate or maybe think of questions that you might like to ask, because you can. Please do. But, reflecting on Patrick Magee now is what, early 70s, maybe 71, 72. You met him to discuss his memoir when Grieving Begins came out. So that was the catalyst and the start of this.
Well, in fact, I did not meet him. It was a Zoom interview.
Zoom, okay.
It was during lockdown, okay. And then, so, in fact, I've never met him.
Have you got any reaction from him to the book?
No. I emailed him. When I was doing the book, I asked him several times for a follow-up interview, and he very politely, firmly declined. And then bits before I went to print, I asked, could I do a fact check? I said, look, can I give you a list of facts that I have in the book in case I've got anything wrong? Even banal stuff like the day it was raining. No, it wasn't. The sun was shining, But he again said no. And then since it came out, I got one message from him saying that he was not going to comment on the contents of the book yet, but that he did want me to make clear to people that he didn't cooperate on the book, that he allowed me to interview him for an article in The Guardian about the Brighton bombing, but that my book came after that, and he wanted it clear that he didn't formally cooperate with the book. So that's the extent of the interactions I've had with him since.
And that's important, Rory, because, the detail you have in the book is incredible. The level of detail, the research you did is amazing. But there are still pieces of evidence, dramatis personae who remain in the dark, shadowy characters that you haven't revealed the details of. There's still a lot of information that cannot come out, even at this stage.
Yes, for the IRA, the terminology they use is this operation had to be kept very tight. And to this day is the same, because in theory, the other people, Magee's accomplices, could be prosecuted and go to jail. And, so they, for them, and also what they call the England department, that was the part of the IRA responsible for exporting the war. It was the holy of holies. That was the most secret part. And, they still, to this day, try to keep a lot of that confidential. And at some point, I was able to part the veil, but not fully. And so at some point, it was quite frustrating as a reporter. You want to know everything, and then pick it. And you can't know everything in this. And so in cases where I couldn't, there's certain people whom I think I know, X person or Y person, or the person who did this, but I don't have the proof, so I don't name them. And also I just had to make peace myself with, certain things that I don't know. And that, with those areas are silences in the story.
Yeah, I mean, what's extraordinary is the level of detail that you do have. I mean, the number of police officers who spoke to you and gave you really granular detail as to how they went about the operations is phenomenal. I mean, you would expect almost the same level of secrecy from them, because you can imagine if the circumstances were the same again, you'd almost, if you happen to be a paramilitary operative, you'd be reading your book to understand the police procedure as to how to track you.
Well, that was a wonderful part of the research, is once I was able to find these police ex-retired detectives and so on and gain their trust, then, it just came pouring out of them. And because they had, from their point of view, a good story to tell. They felt like they got their guy, like this is the Scottish detectives in Glasgow, also some of the ones in Sussex who've been crawling through the rubble. And so they felt they had a great kind of war story, and one for which they never really received credit for. And so for them, it was a chance to revisit, and as they would say, their glory days. And I enjoyed talking to them because these guys, they're now in their 70s, many of them, and they were all almost all kind of working class boys, and they didn't go to posh schools, but they'd been kind of bright kids, and they'd gone into the police and they'd worked their way up the ranks, and they got acquired various specialties, but they still retained that kind of working class kind of view of things, and they, and they're proud of what they had accomplished in life. And I think they were very happy to have their, their role in the story recognized. So, yeah, that was a fun part.
Can I ask you just one anecdote, maybe to finish, or close to finishing? When Patrick Magee checked into the Grand Hotel, he gave an alias. But the alias was a name that would have resonated in Republican tradition, because he used the name Rory Walsh, who was a famous bomber from the early 1970s. Obviously, when he checked in, it was 1984. And you tell a story at the end where Patrick Magee actually encounters Roy Walsh. I'm not going to say any more. Will you tell us about that one?
Yeah, so he used the pseudonym Roy Walsh because, as it turned out, there was, in 1984, when he checked into the hotel, now, at that time, there was a real Roy Walsh, IRA bomber, who had been convicted in 1973 of bombing the Old Bailey. And, I mean, there's a whole fascinating story. I could write a whole separate book just on that. But it's, I think it's basically an homage to, a fellow bomber who had been serving time. And also it was like two fingers to the people who would be hunting him, Magee, by, I think, referencing a former bomber. And actually, Roy Walsh, he had used his own pseudonym in 1973. He had used Tom Clark, who was one of the leaders of 1916. So it's kind of, in a sense, kind of passing the baton one to the next, as they would see it. But anyway, post-Good Friday Agreement, Patrick Magee is freed. He's walking down the Falls Road. And I was told the story by Roy Walsh, who himself had been released a few years earlier. And by then he was this kind of crumpled grandfather figure, and he was selling kind of tickets, lottery tickets or raffles to raise funds for Republican prisoners. And they stop, and they, this kind of literally bumping into each other, but they recognize, they know of each other. They've not been friends. And so he says, Roy Walsh says to Pat, have you got a pound, Pat? Give me a pound, Pat. I won't do the accent. And so Magee fishes out and, buys some of the tickets. And then Roy Walsh is sort of writing the stub. He says, what name, will I put on it, So, and I have this crack where they're, discovering, I'll put in, care of Roy Walsh, And then Magee goes off on his way. And to this day, the real Roy Walsh refers to Patrick Magee as the imposter. And Roy Walsh told me that he never asked Magee about why he had used his name, that, still IRA protocol.
They still don't talk.
Yeah,
take the secrets to the grave, I suppose. But final point, your conclusion to the book, Rory, it's you have to mention the dreaded Brexit, and you kind of talk about kind of an irony, I suppose, that Magee was, unsuccessful in killing Thatcher, for example. He planted a bomb. But you sort of create a thesis, maybe I'm wrong in this, but I thought it was like you created a thesis that actually Thatcher's survival led to a a hardening of, let's say, the right wing of the Tory party, which ultimately pushed Euroscepticism, which ultimately has led to Brexit, which has ultimately led to an economic border down the Irish Sea, and pushing unity stronger than it's ever been. So I think there's an irony that in Thatcher's survival, you believe that that has led to, even a greater occurrence of potential Irish unity.
Yes, and I wouldn't want to over-egg that, but I mean, there are manifold ironies in this, and I mean, also an additional one is the fact that, I've heard other people argue that in a way, Patrick Magee's bomb did kill Thatcher, in that after the bombing, her security details became much more onerous and her movements much more restricted, and that this compounded the isolation that that happened to her, especially in her third term. She lost more and more touch with people around her, her own party, and that this led, her to her downfall. She just kind of lost the plot a bit, and that the fact that she was almost assassinated was one of the reasons that she got cut off from the people around her. But yes, the fact that she then ceded. I wouldn't say ceded Brexit, but I mean certainly she encouraged that strain in the party, and we see where it's led to this day in Northern Ireland. So, and you could add to that, of course, that arguably the IRA are the ones who did more than anything to delay United Ireland. I mean that's a whole separate conversation right there.
Okay, well, a very interesting thesis. Picking up on my friend Alan's question there, on our legal podcast, we always finish by asking people to recommend a book or a movie to our listeners. And why should this be any different, Rory? So any books with a sort of a legal theme, but it doesn't have to be overly legal. Anything that you'd recommend to our loyal listeners here in the tent today?
There is one, and I haven't finished it myself, but it's Jennifer O'Leary's book called The Padre, about Father Patrick Ryan, who was, and he actually appears in this book, he's kind of a secondary character, who was this, priest from Tipperary, former missionary, who became the IRA's money man and conduit to Gaddafi in Libya, and helped to source the timers that were used in bombings. Anyway, her book is quite powerful in that it's about, she's interviewed him about why he did it. And in terms of the legal perspective, I mean, he, unlike Magee, is completely gleeful about what he did. And he says, if I have any regret, it's that it didn't help kill more people. And frankly, there's something monstrous really about it. I mean, he's almost like literally rubbing his hands with, in recalling his greatest hits in terms of the bombings, including the Hyde Park bombing, in which he had a role. And when he has that attitude, it's so kind of unrepentant, and yet he was never. I mean, the British knew about him, all through the 1980s, and there's a whole big attempt to have him extradited from Belgium and then from Ireland. And Margaret Thatcher, in a sense, put her foot in it. I mean, she spoke, said something she shouldn't have said in the House of Commons, which made it more difficult to extradite him. So there's a whole, legally, I just think it's a really interesting time to revisit, for example, why IRA suspects were not extradited from Ireland. And I think, so
thanks.
Jennifer O'Leary's book, The Padre.
Definitely one to read. He also had a brother who was a Fine Gael county councillor in Tipperary at the time, if I remember correctly. Okay, we've been told to wrap it up there. It's our time is done. Can we just say an absolutely huge thank you to Rory for this incredible talk. So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can we say a huge thank you again to Rory Carroll for joining us at the Electric Picnic. And Mark, the studio will never be the same again, will it?
It's just not quite the same if you
just
don't
need
have
the roar of the crowd. The roar of the crowd, the Ave is vehement. Wasn't that the line from Shakespeare? So next week, folks, normal service will resume. We'll be back in the studio, and we're looking forward to that as well. Before we go, I'd like to say a big thank you to our producer, Conal O'Moroyne. Can I say a huge thank you to Peter Rice again for the wonderful editing job on Rory Carroll's interview and making it sound so clear, really, when there was a lot going on in the background at the time. And also to Lee Brennan, who's recorded this for us and is doing a wonderful job as always. So that's it, folks. So for me, Peter Leonard.
And myself, Mark Tottenham.
Thank you for listening, and we will see you soon in the Fifth Court.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next